Thank you for coming along to this NICEC Network Meeting on careers in a post-COVID world. Welcome to those of you who are familiar with NICEC, and if you're not, NICEC is a professional institution whose remit is to look at careers, education and counselling from a multiple perspectives of research, policy and practice and education. And we run these meetings fairly regularly to explore and discuss interesting trends within the world of careers and employability. My name is David Winter. My day job is within the Careers Group, University of London, where I am Head of Research and Organisational Development, which is obviously a job title which needs no explanation because I have no idea what it means either. I'm also the Learning Director for AGCAS, the Association of Graduate Careers Advisory Services, and so part of my job there is to look after the professional development of careers professionals within higher education across the UK. And I'm also a NICEC Fellow. This session is Careers in a Post-COVID World, where we're going to try and explore some of the long-term effects and implications of the pandemic on the job market, on individuals and employers. We're not necessarily going to answer every question, but we've got a very exciting selection of speakers who are presenting different perspectives, and apologise if there's noise in the background because that's my wife who shares an office with me in a meeting at the same time. So we have Tony Wilson from the Institute of Employment Studies, who's going to be giving us a kind of bigger picture of the impact of COVID on the job market and on employment trends generally. We've got Stephen Ishwood from the Institute of Student Employers, who's going to talk about the reactions of employers to COVID and what changes in practices there might have been there. We've got Fiona Christie from Manchester Met and also a NICEC Fellow who's going to talk about the impact on young people and the project that she's working on in relation to that. And then Kim Chaplin from the Centre for Ageing Better, who's going to be talking about the impact on older people of COVID. So that's the lineup, and basically the program for the day is we've got the welcome introductions. We've got our panelists who will have 20 minutes each just to present you with some fascinating insights. We then have a 15-minute slot for some Q&A. So please do, if you have questions as you go along, please either remember them and talk about them afterwards as we mute them, or just put them in the chat and I will try to monitor the chat and maybe I will ask the question on your behalf as part of that. So do have a look at the chat as well. What we're then going to do is to have an opportunity for discussion because the network is part of this meeting. So we're going to put you into some random groups where you can talk about whatever you've been inspired to talk about as a result of the panelists. And then I'm going to kind of shuffle you up again halfway through so that you're talking to some different people. So 10 minutes for each of those things. During those discussion groups, if you have got interesting insights, revelations, resources, or any brilliant things that you'd like other people to be aware of and to share, we have set up a Padlet to share that. The link is on the screen. There's also a QR code there, so that if you know how to use a QR code with your mobile device, you can just point the camera at that QR code and it will take you to the Padlet, and you may wish to open that now. I will also put it in the chat at some point as we go along so that you can just click on a link if you want to use it on the same computer. We're recording the sessions in the main room, so the panelists and the Q&A and the feedback and close at the end, where we're just going to wrap things up, but we won't be recording the sessions in the breakout rooms. So that's basically it from me. What I will now do is hand over to our first speaker, who is Tony Wilson, and I think Tony is about to kind of share his own screen.
Could I just catch you first?
Oh yes, Lynn, go for it.
Sorry, I'm supposed to be looking after the waiting room and I can't access it. So could you just look after it as our first speaker starts?
Yeah, of course I will. Yes, I will.
Right. Thanks, David. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I hope people can see my screen. Just shout if you can't. I'll assume that you can. I'm particularly excited that we're 5 minutes ahead of the agenda. So I'm wondering if that means I can speak for 25 minutes instead. I think not. Let's keep to 20 minutes, and then that'll give us even more time for discussion, which would be great. As unfortunately, I'm really sorry, I will have to duck off. I've got a couple of deadlines and another meeting at, before 5 o'clock. So yeah, I'm going to talk. I want to set the scene a little bit really about where we are in this recovery from COVID-19 in the labour market. It's about the kind of the impacts of the crisis, but then where do we go next, and what are the implications in terms of the sorts of jobs that are being created and the work that we still have to do in getting back, well, not even getting back to where we were, creating a labour market that is able to support people to have sort of fair, rewarding, decent work and careers. So the first point, the big point to make, I think, and today is a particularly important point to be making this as the coronavirus job retention scheme officially draws to a close, is that in no small part, thanks to the furlough scheme, the crisis that so much of our policy response has been preparing for just isn't the one that we've got. Back in last summer was after the plan for jobs was announced. It was after the job retention scheme. Well, it was around the time the plan for jobs was announced, but it was after the job retention scheme was put in place. Everyone was expecting that by the time the furlough scheme had been removed, which was going to be the turn of 2021, we'd be facing 4 million people unemployed, an unemployment crisis that we had not seen the likes of since the early 1990s. By November, with the generally improved outlook for the labour market, but still the intention to wind up the furlough scheme, the forecast was that unemployment would be something more like 2.5 million. So big, not quite as bad as the 2010s recession, but still pretty big. By March, the forecast was down. By May, forecast was down again. Even this forecast has been beaten in effect by outturn unemployment. Unemployment has peaked. It peaked at about 5.2% earlier this year. It will not go back to those heights again. In all likelihood, it will continue to fall towards 4% overall. Had we had anything like the impact on employment and unemployment that we should have had, given the sheer scale of the fall in GDP, which was the biggest we'd ever seen, we would have faced 3 million fewer people in work, and much of that feeding through into unemployment. As it was, we still had the largest fall in employment since the early 90s. But there's an interesting stat. It's not actually 75, 1972. 1972 was the last recession where unemployment peaked lower than where it's peaked now. Back in those days when unemployment was not a price worth paying during big adjustments, and actually we've had a very sort of Keynesian response, frankly, with the amount of money that's been spent on supporting households and firms through the crisis. And it's really clear, point two, we're in the grip of a really strong hiring recovery. Vacancies are now the highest they've ever been. This is not a false dawn. This is going to be sustained. Vacancies are not going to come down anytime soon. They are significantly higher than pre-crisis levels. They'll remain there, and they have risen across every single industry, every single sector in the economy. And this means, here's a spoiler alert for the job stats, which will be out in 2 weeks' time, a week on Tuesday, I think. We're about to see the lowest ever number of unemployed people per vacancy. And we know that because the vacancy survey runs 1 month ahead of the unemployment survey, the labour force survey. So in effect, we know what the figure is going to be. It's going to be about 1.35 unemployed people per vacancy. 6 months ago, I was writing briefings and giving presentations about the other spike, about how we had no jobs and all these unemployed people and potentially more to come. And we were facing the highest ever ratio of unemployed people per vacancy. The crisis we've got is the exact opposite. Not enough workers for the number of jobs being created. And if you like beverage curves, who doesn't like beverage curves? I mean, beverage curves are a bit out of fashion, but this is a way that you measure the relationship between vacancies and unemployment. So vacancies run top to bottom here, vacancies per 100 employees, and unemployment runs left to right. So what you tend to see is in a sort of good, strong, functioning economy and labour market, like this blue, the dark blue, the nice decade, you tend to see the bit of stability here, consistently low unemployment, decent numbers of vacancies. The Great Recession, really high unemployment, low vacancies. The recovery, an improvement in unemployment and rising vacancies, pushing it up towards the left. COVID crisis, we lost the jobs, but we didn't have the impact on unemployment. Very odd behaviour there, that light blue line. And now, well, next month in particular is a dotted line. We're heading off the chart. These are major labour market inefficiencies which will create pressures in the economy and inhibit growth. It will mean growth is lower than it could be. But also, these are real problems for all of us, as we can see now, as we in the various crises that we're facing. And oddly though, really, really importantly, this is a jobs-light recovery. Unemployment has not risen as much as it could have done, and it is going to continue to fall, but employment has not recovered anywhere near the extent it should have done either. The yellow bar here is the most recent quarter of data, and the blue is the fall over the previous period since the crisis began. So right now this is 14 months of fall, and well, it's 14 months is the blue, and then the most recent 3 months is the yellow. And anyway, what this shows is really big falls in employment, as we know, a larger rise in inactivity and unemployment, but actually the improvement's been pretty modest across the piece in the most recent quarter. So this is the other sort of big headline, which will be in our briefing. Well, we might even put a briefing out before the labour market stats, but it will certainly be in our labour market stats briefing on the day. That there's about 1 million fewer people in the labour market than we would have expected on pre-crisis trends. When we ask where have all the workers gone, it isn't all Brexit, it isn't furlough, it isn't unemployment. A lot of it is older people and younger people simply leaving the labour market. Had those people stayed in it, there'd be 1 million more people in there working and looking for work, and vacancies would be lower, and that Beveridge curve would look better. And look, this is like pretty much the first time ever we've seen a fall like this. You know, these things simply do not happen. You would have to go back to the 1980s. And you know, the managed exit of particularly older workers during the 1980s through early retirement policies to see like labour markets properly contracting. We just haven't been used to this for decades, and policy isn't ready for it either. And this is how that million adds up when you look by age and gender. And you could spend hours on a chart like this, and we'll send them round so you will get a chance to have a proper look at it. But there's a few striking, this is levels. It would look better with rates, but I wanted it to add up to 1 million. But with the levels, you can see here, look, there's fewer older women are in work than older men anyway. So these falls, this is equivalent of the 6 percentage point fall in the participation rate for older women compared with 3.5 percentage points for men. And a lot of this is women aged over 65. Now, where do you go if you're over 65 and you want help to find a new job? You don't recruit an agency, I guess. And a lot of that will probably be with part-time workers in retail. There'll be other things too, clearly, but you know, that's where we had a really significant labour market shakeout. And the other piece here is young people, young men in particular, moving into education and not work. So the highest ever participation rate in education, lowest ever participation rate in work for young people. And there'll be some of this is migration, 25 to 34-year-old men. You know, some of this is going to be migration as well, clearly. So lower immigration overall explains about a quarter, higher economic inactivity explains the rest. And this does exclude furloughed workers, but I think furloughed workers is probably about 200,000, may even be fewer by now. So if we dive a bit more into economic inactivity for people aged 16 to 64, we see this picture being borne out. The blue line here is students, so it's people economically inactive because they're in education. That's risen a lot in the crisis, appears to now be levelling off. That's mainly young people. A lot of that's higher education, post A-level fiasco and opening up places, etc. But also really elevated numbers of people long-term sick, and that figure's rising. You know, it's a shocking indictment of our sort of public policy response and support for people with health conditions. 2.15 million people are not in work, not looking for work because of a long-term health condition. Big rise in early retirement, which is further down, and a rise in inactivity for other reasons, things like shielding. Interestingly, quite big falls in the numbers of people looking after family at home, which could reflect simply fewer women having kids, because a lot of this is people who are off work for when their children are very young. But it might also be women being able to stay in work or having to move into work, you know, because of other impacts on their household finances in the crisis. And as well as that, for all that, you know, we're in the grip of a recovery. The recovery doesn't feel like one if you're a disabled person in particular. I mean, I don't want to generalize. These incredibly diverse groups within this, and we tend to, you know, bundle people up by sort of broad demographic characteristics. But disabled people twice as likely to be out of work as non-disabled people, and that sort of demographic-led narrowing of the gap in employment probability, which was going far too slowly before the crisis, but it was nonetheless narrowing, has now stalled or may even be reversing. And for ethnic minority employment, the employment rate gap was narrowing, again driven by demography, particularly higher participation for ethnic minority women, for Pakistani and Bangladeshi women in particular. But now that gap is stable, even widening, and that's been driven in particular by poorer outcomes for Black people and Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups as well. So this is really, you know, really concerning trends. Interestingly, there's a light blue line here, which is young people not in full-time education. That gap is now narrowing again. So if you're not in full-time education, your chances of being in work are rising, which is what you'd expect. I wouldn't be at all surprised if by this time next year, the employment rate for young people not in full-time education is higher than the employment rate for everyone else. And the other really concerning thing in the current data is long-term unemployment. I use this graph for quite a long view, because I think I do think we have to be careful about overstating the challenge here. Long-term unemployment was shockingly high after the 2010s recession, although even that was lower than the 1990s, but it was far too high, unacceptably high, 1 million people long-term unemployed. Right now, we're about half those levels. It may have leveled off for young people with the improvements in the economy. It may still be getting worse for older people, but it's a problem, and our policy, I think we do actually have a policy response on this, but I think it's something that we're just going to have to really focus on as we go forward. So, gosh, I think I'm going to stay within 20 minutes, which is brilliant. So, where are the jobs? This is obviously something that's really important to all of you, people involved in careers research and also in career services. This IFS graph, this is a great bit of work by the IFS published last week, which you'll find if you sort of Google it around the jobs recovery, and it's got some really fascinating, really good analysis of how people move between different occupations and the availability of different jobs for people with different occupational groups or different backgrounds, according to the sorts of jobs that people do. But one of the sort of vignettes from that was this graph here, and I think this shows us two things. Clearly, it shows us that there's been significant growth in what they describe as low quality work, which typically means relatively low paid and less secure work and relatively lower skilled. That's higher. That's largely explained by hospitality and by low skilled work related to online shopping, etc. But we mustn't lose sight here. Medium and high skilled vacancies, medium and high quality in their terms, vacancies are back to pre-crisis levels. And they're back, and pre-crisis levels is above actually the immediate pre-crisis, that 100%, they're only about 90% in early 2020. The economy was cooling as we went into COVID, or certainly the labour market was. Vacancies have come back really strongly, and I'm an optimist on this. They've come back really strongly across all areas, and that's really quite remarkable given the depths of that crisis and how grim things were looking just 6 months ago. They're now back up to pre-crisis levels on medium and high quality, quote unquote, jobs too. But this is just a little extract from that analysis which talks about the sorts of jobs that people with different characteristics do. To just describe this, so this is sort of this is showing the percentage of job types where there are more opportunities, broadly similar opportunities, or fewer opportunities than pre-crisis. So across the economy as a whole, it's pretty evenly fixed, pretty evenly spread. But you can see here for degree educated people, things are generally a little bit worse. There's generally a bit, you're more likely to have occupations with less demands than occupations with more demands, if that makes sense. For people with lower qualifications, there's more likely to be the sorts of occupations that you work in are going to have higher demands than to have lower demands. There's not any particularly strong differences otherwise, but that does kind of stand out. This does feel like we don't tend to talk an enormous amount about how difficult life can be for graduates looking for work. Or at least they don't tend to get as much attention perhaps as some other groups, but I do think there are some questions and concerns here. Is this going to start to improve now as the economy's reopening and offices are reopening and etc., or actually is this a more secular sort of shift in demand? I do feel sort of fairly optimistic about some of this too, because we have seen really significant growth in kind of knowledge economy jobs over decades actually, but it is a cause for pause for concern, I think. And then thinking about job quality as well more broadly, I think surprisingly, we've seen really significant falls in part-time employment. Now, these are on these axes start in different places. It's the same scale, but they start in different places. So the axis on the left starts at 30% to 46. The one on the right, the one on the right is 30 to 46. The one on the left is 0 to 16. So a higher proportion of women in work part-time, a much higher proportion. But the fall's been massive. The fall's been really, we've never seen a fall this big. There was a general sort of trend towards lower part-time work amongst women, which was partly demographic, largely demographic. A really significant fall now. I suspect this is actually over 65-year-old women leaving jobs, particularly in retail, that's driven this. So some of it's compositional. But we are also seeing a rise in the number of people in temporary work who want permanent work. That's the yellow line. and a smaller rise in a number of people in part-time work who want full-time work, even though part-time employment overall is falling. So this is a worry, because this suggests that people aren't getting the kind of flexibility or security that they need and want in work. And this may be feeding higher inactivity, because one of the really important reasons why don't look for work is if they don't think they can get jobs with the sort of security, flexibility and support they might need in work. And it also kind of gives the lie a little bit to the strength of the recovery. This is a very strong recovery, but it doesn't appear to be strong enough yet for firms to offer more permanent jobs with more hours and more security. We do hear a lot about temp to perm recruitment at the moment, and that's not particularly good sell for somebody with a long-term health condition who hasn't been back in work hasn't worked for a long time, or for a parent who needs to organise childcare for the first time, or for the first time in years. We need to do better. I also always want to say about the shift to home working. I'm not really going to focus on this particularly, but we've done a lot of work on this. Colleagues here have. The Work After Lockdown project, really recommend Googling that and looking at some of the work we've done there. But clearly the shift to home working, and it's always been a minority who works from home. It's never been more than about a third of the workforce. But this shift to home working has clearly taken its toll. And many of these sort of warning signs around future mental ill health are very concerning. This is from survey work that we conducted as part of this project. And we can do something about this, particularly as improving home working piece, because the sorts of people who have better experiences of home working were the sorts of people who have just better work. And decent work doesn't always mean particularly well paid work. It doesn't always mean, that you're the most highly skilled work, but it's work that gives you job satisfaction, work in an organisation that you're committed to, that shares your values, where you've got good line management support, and where you've got more control over your work as well. So we can definitely improve on these things. So look, I'm going to wrap up. This is a crisis. I'm not quite going to wrap up. This is a bit sort of where are we on the policy piece and the crisis. But this is a crisis, but it's actually a recruitment crisis. It's not the one we thought. It's not an unemployment crisis. And disadvantaged groups appear to still be losing out as well. And our policy response is geared up for the wrong thing. I mean, it's geared up for, rightly, we've made, for the right reasons, we've ended up with an enormous amount of provision to tackle, basically, to head off massive rising unemployment and job shortages. This is just a selection of the things that have been announced in the plan for jobs. And in the plan for jobs, we've announced more spending, more more initiatives than any previous recession. But look, how on earth do we make sense of that for individuals that you're talking to, who you're working with, for employers in particular, and for ourselves and each other in trying to navigate that system and trying to make sense of what's available for whom? So I think there's 6 really important challenges for the future. The first then, top challenge now is increasing participation in the labour market. It has to be, and that's something we're not prepared for. That means things like improving access to occupational health support, improving mental health support, better integrating employment services alongside health services, better engagement with older workers, older people who are further from work, access to employment services for people who don't claim benefits or don't claim the right benefit, more flexible childcare, more transport, etc. Those are all public policy bits. But point 4 here, it's also about what firms do. For people who are economically inactive, I don't want to generalise completely, but it's often not about whether a job pays £8.90 or £9.40 an hour or £9.90. But employers are reaching for the pay lever as if that's the solution to their recruitment problems. It's not enough. It's not enough. We need to be looking at job flexibility, job design, length of shifts, quality of shifts, line management support, how we organise our workplaces, how we better engage with and support people. Employers have so much more they can do here, and many of them haven't had to do this since the 1990s or early 2000s. We must work better with employers on this, and we must expect more from employers on doing this too. We also have to deliver really good quality employment services, especially for long-term unemployed. And really importantly, gosh, who would think that at this point in our lives we'd be having conversations like this that weren't also talking about net zero, about the knowledge economy, about the huge transitions and technology-driven change in the labour market. These are things that we have to come back to quite urgently, I think, in the future as we think about how we better support people for the future world of work. The final point, we really need to improve how public services work. This was a quote from work I did for the LGA a few years ago, where the individual who took part in the research put it far better than me. You get a lot of information. The support is there, but it's like giving the ingredients but not teaching you how to cook. So I think the challenge for all of us, particularly the spending review and a levelling up white paper and everything else coming, is how we make sense of this system, particularly for young people, but it applies for everybody, where it seems like sometimes everybody's responsible, but nobody's really accountable for helping an individual to navigate the system, helping an employer to find the right person, helping organisations to deliver better public services that serve the public. I think that's enough for me. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tony. And pretty much perfect in terms of timing. Thank you very much indeed. Some really interesting things to think about there. For those who joined a little bit late, all the panelists are going to have a chance to speak for 20 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of that, if you have them. And if you do have questions, do pop them into the chat as well. But without further ado, I will hand over to Stephen Isherwood from the ISC. Just very quickly, some people are already adding stuff to the Padlet, so thank you very much for doing that, and keep going. And I'm putting the Padlet link into the chat. So Stephen, over to you.
Great, thanks, David. I was saying to David that I've decided not to use any slides, actually, because I recognise quite a few names to the chat, and I thought you probably over the last few months you've bought a death of seeing ISC's market slide. And also I knew Tony was on up front, and you know I can't compete with the detail in Tony's slides, so so you can stare at my ugly mug for 20 minutes or so. I think most of you do know who the ISC, but just in case there's somebody that haven't been around, just sort of the graduate careers landscape, it used to be the AGR, and we changed our name because employers have changed their behaviour, partly because of the apprentice levy, other forces. So the world we cover is I think that what students sort of best describes what we do. But there's two things to caveat on the things I'm going to say. One is that we're at the higher skilled end of the market, so our employers really tend to be thinking about level 4/5 and above, although they would argue that the biggest challenges they face are dealing with the apprentice level in the apprentice market. The bulk of the recruitment still does actually happen in the graduate space when it comes to our members. And the other thing I would say is that we are at the structured end of student recruitment. So we definitely don't deal with the S in SMEs. Some of the more medium-sized businesses we do have as members. But if an organisation doesn't have somebody whose specialist role is to look after graduates and apprentices, recruitment and development, even if it's only sort of half a role, actually they can't get value of the ISE. So they tend not to join. In fact, we don't necessarily encourage them to join because they won't get that much out of it. So again, what I'm talking about really is the perspective from those employers that recruit early talent, but in a structured way onto some form of development program. So there's three things I kind of want to cover off. Go a bit Jacob Marley, so past, present and future. So how did COVID impact the employers in our world, and how did they respond? Where are we at now? And I definitely echo what Tony's just been telling us in terms of the market. That data does apply when you look at our niche of it. So talk about where we're at now and the kind of changes that employers have made that are sticking, and then just a little bit around where I think we're going over to the next 12 months and beyond, although I always hesitate to get my crystal ball out because I'm 9 times out of 10 wrong. So so let's just do a little recap. What happened when the pandemic struck? Most of our employers stopped recruiting. They were already partway through their recruitment seasons, and actually they just put a hold or a pause on their recruitment activities. Of course, I'm as always generalizing about a labour market which has all sorts of pitfalls, because we deal with different sectors and we deal with different employers in sectors. So I could talk to you about employers in the travel business, airlines. Of course, they just couldn't bring their hires into their business, so they did actually withdraw offers from candidates. And then you had other organisations that were actually increasing their hiring because demand was going up. But in general, he says generalising again, I would say that the more professional services type organisations, they either stuck with their hiring numbers or they only decreased them very, very slightly. And there's two reasons behind that. One is, of course, how late we were in the cycle, and a lot of recruitment had already been done. And the other is, Tony mentioned previous recessions, and employers with longer memories, do remember that, particularly in the early 90s, that actually when they cut back too hard in a recession, actually their businesses really got hurt 3 years down the line. So we talk about the economy recovering, you get back into a situation where you need qualified accountants, you need qualified lawyers, you need people moving into middle management positions. If you don't have those people coming through the pipeline, actually you can't, deliver the work that you want to at that stage. So yeah, like employers who are thinking a bit more longer term, remember that that they very much build that kind of thinking into their theories. We did see non-graduate vacancies fall faster, apprentice type vacancies. Again, there's a number of factors in that, but one of those is that kind of apprentice level recruitment does tend to happen later in the cycle. It tends to be the graduate bit gets done first, and then they move to school leavers and apprentices. And when I said that employers should stop recruiting, of course, those were the vacancies that were hit most. I've talked about organisations that stopped recruiting, but actually quite a lot did then resume recruitment once the initial shock of the pandemic, once it had hit. In our world, like most bits of the recruitment market, employers have been using much more technology in terms of recruitment over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. So video interviewing, online testing, and that very, very commonly being used at early stages. That was there beforehand, nothing new in that. But of course, what employers had to do was pivot. They're more the stuff further in the process. So the assessment centre type operation. 90% of our employers use an assessment centre, and that's what they had to do. So that's adjusting existing exercises. We had employers who were able to adapt their role plays to do them online. The thing that surprised me was group exercises. I thought, I can't really see how a group exercise is going to work very well on Zoom. But actually, a lot of employers told us they were unable to make it work effectively. So lots of employers pivoted very quickly and were able to move their recruitment online. I mentioned earlier that sector and employer piece, because as well as knowing which sector was or has been impacted more, it's also about employers within a sector. I think one of the best examples of this is Primark. Everybody talks about how badly retail's been hit. This is sort of a double whammy of an industry and problems anyway, and then COVID comes on top. If you look at Primark, I mean, they're not very big in the early talent space, but business, cash reserves, very unleveraged, i.e. not high debt. They handed back their government support money and have responded very quickly. So yes, within sectors, it's also looking at individual organisations. So yes, employers pivoted very quickly to recruitment. Then as we got into the new recruitment season, starting in September last year, all the months merge into one a little bit, don't they? Again, we saw lots more employers sort of reopening up their vacancies. Maybe it's not as much as before, not as quickly, because a lot of cautiousness from employers. And it's interesting what Tony was saying about that temp to perm piece. I remember this from my being working through the last couple of recessions. Employers really cautious. They might be willing to turn the taps on to hiring, but really cautious about committing too much cost or fixed cost into the organisations. So that doesn't surprise me. And we're seeing that. So we're seeing lots of employers are, yes, they're getting more active, but very, very tight controls of those budgets. Lots of employers that we talk to, they're sort of pulling their hair out because they can't get the business to release funds to do the work that they wanted to do. A quick mention on what happened with internships and placements. Again, most organisations couldn't do internships for obvious reasons, but actually I was quite heartened by the response of lots of employers. Lots of employers were able to take, for example, their training programs that they might have delivered to interns and do those online and offer something maybe a week or 2 weeks. I know one of the employers in the insurance industry that still did a full 8-week placement program, an international global placement program. They didn't move people around, obviously, but were able to offer a full. But that was rare. That was quite rare. Somebody like IBM, you know, they brought all their placement students in. I mean, they're a business that very much has a mobile remote workforce anyway, so they were able to pivot very, very quickly. They kept their placements on who were already in the business, and they brought the new cohort. So there were some positive stories, but in reality, most organisations had to shrink back quite considerably that intern piece. Which, when you think about the future, that means there is a cohort of students in the last year that will not have had as much work experience in all its forms, you know, whether it's a Canary Wharf type internships or whether it's just working, you know, part-time in a pub or restaurant, that helps them into that employment market. So definitely a cutback in that piece. And again, onboarding, so organizations were able to switch to onboarding. So those organizations that were still keeping their cohorts coming in were very much able to do their onboarding programs online. And to be honest with you, it's not easy in the sense of it you know, takes time and effort and there's pressure to do it, but actually logically it's relatively straightforward. When you think lots of learning has shifted online anyway, that stuff moving online is pretty easy. The challenges employers have had is actually it's the water cooler type conversations, it's the learning at desk, it's the building at networks, it's getting involved in, you know, in activities that increase the culture, and lots of employers have been trying lots of different things to try and make that happen with varying degrees of success. But I'll go off on a bit of a tangent if we start talking too much about that. Yeah, lots of learning in that kind of activities. So that, I would say, is where we were at until the early part of this year. Once we started to see, you know, lockdowns being eased, we started to see recovery and people thinking a bit more about the future. And we have definitely started to see a strong recovery in actual vacancies. One of the reasons I'm not showing you data today is because the last time we did a survey on this was April. Our recruitment survey, our main big annual recruitment survey, has literally closed yesterday, and we'll be producing that information in November, so keep your eye out for that. But I expect that to show a very healthy increase in vacancies this year. Anecdotally, talking to employers, they're running hot at the moment. You know, they've got cost pressures, they might have had to reduce their team size, but the business is asking for more hiring at all levels. So yeah, this is probably, you know, just listening to the mood music. Everybody's busy at this time of year, but it seems to be significantly upper level this year. So that's kind of where employers are at, I guess, from the operational perspective. But what are they doing and keeping in terms of actual recruitment activity that they learned through the pandemic? And I think this is where we'll see some of those longer term changes into the way that employers behave, because they've learned to do things differently. And if I take the whole recruitment cycle, and I said that, you know, a big chunk of it was online already, but actually they've learned to do other bits in the cycle online. So therefore, if you're able to save cost because you haven't got to pull as many people into a building to do things like assessment centre, you haven't got to pay for travel, you haven't got to try and get people out of the business to run those assessment centres. You know, again, if I go back to my previous jobs, just getting enough meeting rooms to run an assessment centre is a battle in itself. So there's all kind of savings there that employers will look to bank. And this is me sort of crystal balling a bit now, because I think market forces will have an impact because it is competitive. It's always been competitive to get the best talent in our market. So that will also be a force. It's not purely cost pressures, but I think where they can do a lot of the activities will stay online. So what we might see is the bulk of assessment still happening online, but maybe a final interview actually happening in the office. And I was talking to one employer only this morning, and that is exactly what they're doing. They're doing everything online, but they are now starting to do a final interview in the office to allow candidates to come in. And if you think about it, that's quite a logical decision, because if it's just the final interview and you've done everything else, you're pretty much talking to somebody you're fairly sure you're going to want to hire. So that's where you do the high touch, high cost activities. The other thing that businesses have said to me is they've been able to deploy more senior people. And I know this is a constant theme around, actually, you know, what's the quality like? I'm normally an apologist for employers, but actually sometimes getting your best people out on on campus and into activities is difficult, because your best people are the most in demand, and sometimes it's the people on the bench who are the ones that the business frees up to go and do stuff. So they've been able to deploy some of the higher quality people into their online attraction and selection activities. So again, I think some of that will stick. How will employers behave on Canvas? Again, on campus. A huge variety of thinking out there at the moment. The larger scale employers I talk to say that actually they have seen positive outcomes in terms of diversity of their intakes. By doing selection online, they have found that some of those biases that creep in, around how somebody looks, present themselves, that stuff is muted a bit when it comes to doing things online. And again, the employers we work with are very well behaved in terms of their online recruitment. They do put a lot of effort into sort of, giving people pre-information about the process around what it's going to be like and how it's going to work. So again, I think some of that positivity will definitely stick as we get into new ways of doing things. I think there's a real challenge, and this is something that we're doing quite a bit of work on at the moment, in terms of how campus attraction activities will work. I won't go on to a long riff around how generous the UK jobs market is compared to pretty much anywhere else in the world. But how do you get to talk to those students that you want to talk to? And when actually I've talked about the cost and the energy that's required to get onto campus. And it's interesting, a lot of the employers I talk to, they are talking about relying less on university organised activities. They will still do it. They're asking for a bit more of a bespoke approach. But what they're saying is they get the best traction with candidates. They can get candidates onto their website, onto their platforms. And there's a number of reasons behind that. But one of the key ones actually is the data they get. If you get somebody onto your own platform, you get data on who's participating. You're able to build a stronger connection with them and keep that connection going after the event. So their conversion rates are better. So there seems to be, again, a shift in thinking at the moment going on with employers. Like everything else, such an uncertain landscape, it's difficult to predict just quite where this will land, but that's definitely where the conversation is at the moment. So again, like recruitment and selection, I think the attraction piece, we will see, a shift back of the pendulum, but not all the way, and market forces will be a factor. If you think about top flight law firms, if one firm thinks that actually the other firm's getting better candidates because they're on campus, they're doing all this activities, they're gonna follow suit at some point. So we'll have to see how that kind of stuff pans out. Just before I finish, I'm conscious of time. I think I've got a couple of minutes left. Just a little bit more thinking around actually what might that future look like and the future of jobs. And I think it's really interesting at the moment. I think it's going to be very interesting in terms of policy and government direction. We've seen the change at the ministerial level. I've been saying, all the pandemic, that the undertow of policy and conversation coming out of the political sphere is about this vocational piece, vocational roles, things like the apprentice levy, T levies, the funding of FE as opposed to HE. I definitely don't think that's going away. So on the one hand, we've got this pull towards more vocational transitions through education into work. And a great example is the degree apprenticeship. Again, I've mentioned IBM already. I'll mention them again. They love degree apprenticeships in the tech space because the pace of learning is more suited to their business. Being able to sort of be more reactive in terms of the content is better for them, and their hires tend to be more committed when they join. They perform better and they stay longer, so they love it. But then the bulk of our employers are still generalist employers, and they will say to me that actually their students they hire that don't necessarily have a relative qualification over time tend to perform better. And I think developments like London Interdisciplinary School, I think they're really interesting in the way they're doing and how that might connect with employers, particularly as we talk to employers and think about their future skills need and the future way that work will operate, that need to move more quickly, to iterate on the go. I was talking to a HR director of a tech firm, Some of you maybe used this quote before, and she said, you know, they're still absolutely committed to hiring early talent. They know they're relatively green and they need training and development, but she said that the way we do that has changed. The pace is quicker. She likened it to joining you know, a fast-moving motorway. You've kind of got to get with the flow and get up to speed. So yes, learn, yes, less, you know, still make mistakes and all that kind of stuff, but having more control over your learning, and it's less about a program that will, you know, have set interventions and pop you out after 2 or 3 years into a manager role. She said that's not the way it works now. So I think that's where the more generalist thinking, I think, is quite interesting. But as I said, I think there's 2 different pools at the moment, so it'd be quite interesting to see the balance between those. And just a final thought, really, to wrap up. And I can encapsulate this by actually. I was talking to EY, my previous employer, a few weeks ago. Back when I was running student recruitment at EY, we would typically get about 15,000 applications, 12,000, 15,000 for roughly 1,000 vacancies in a year, and that's a lot of people to process. Last year, their hiring numbers, their application numbers were 70,000 applications for roughly the same number, and I think there's huge issues with that. There's operational issues at a very crude level of processing those number of people, but that's, you know, that's 69,000 people being told no. And what does that mean for mental health? What does that mean for their career decisions? What does that mean around the whole diversity and inclusion piece? So although employers have opened up much more, of course, they're rejecting many more. And I haven't seen Nalani's name. Actually, Nalani worked very closely with me on a session that used to close our conference this summer. And I think there is still this tension between a school or a university or a college having to provide careers advice and guidance to its entire cohort. And the bottom line is the employer is only really fundamental bottom line interest in those people they're going to hire. So the way they approach their testing, you know, the psychology theories that go into that it's different. And I think there's something that we can all work on. Like I said, they're still informed at the moment, is actually getting some of that understanding of the career journeys people need to make, how that decision process is made, and how organizations pull people into their organizations, how they develop them over those 2 or 3 years. Because I think there's some breaks in that process, and as a whole generous sector, we can do a lot more to increase our understanding to ease those transitions through. But I think I've got a couple over minutes, a couple of minutes over, David. So I will shut up at that point.
Thank you very much. Actually, 20 seconds. That's fine. Again, almost perfect. Thank you very much, Stephen. Again, so we've moved from a kind of big picture view of the economy to a bit more of a kind of personalized view of what's happening in different employers and in different sectors. We're now going to shift our attention to look at the individuals who are affected by the pandemic. Again, just a quick plug for the Padlet. There are some good resources being added there, so please do get to that and add any resources. But also, if you do have questions that occur to you as our panelists are speaking, please do pop them in the chat, and I'm quite happy to ask them on your behalf or call upon you to ask them. Now I'm going to hand over to Fiona Christie from Manchester Met University, who's going to talk about the impact on young people and the project that she's working in.
Thanks very much, David. Just going to share my screen now. Okay, is that working? Okay, everybody see my first slide all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Brilliant, good. Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me, David. So yes, I'm Fiona Christie. I'm a researcher at Manchester Met and the Decent Work and Productivity Research Centre. I'm also ICAS Director of Research and Knowledge, and also I'm a NICEC Fellow. So I call myself a pracademic really because I was a careers professional for 20 years before I moved into a research role. So I approach some of these topics with a bit of a sort of hybrid approach, really. I'd like to also acknowledge that, I mean, basically, I'm doing something quite different from Tony and Stephen because I'm reporting on the live project, a small-scale live project, a longitudinal qualitative project that I'm working on. And actually, acknowledgements, I've had a really good research assistant who's helped me with this project, who's a young person herself, so she's done quite a lot of the interviews and has contributed to analysing the results. So Adele, she's not here today, but I just wanted to acknowledge her because she's put a lot of work into this project. And I'm talking about the impact of COVID-19 on young workers, even though the research project that I'm talking about here, actually I conceived of prior to COVID, and we were interested in exploring young workers and how they experienced insecure working lives and so on. But actually, when COVID came along, we hadn't started the project. We knew we were going to do the project. We had to pivot to the COVID-19 context when we did the project, really. And I know David's very interested in considering careers in a post-COVID world. I'm going to be presenting a snapshot of my research about young workers and during the COVID times, but I do think there are implications for the post-COVID world based on what I've discovered. So let's just move on. Bear with me. Yeah, so that's our project. Just to acknowledge, I got some funding from the British Academy, so it's an academic aspect of this project, and I will make some sort of academic references because it's academic funding behind the project. So I've got to have that sort of practical but also academic theoretical approach to the topic, really. And just to say that some of the ideas that did influence the project in terms of my thinking prior to the project, but during the project, I just wanted to mention a few, really. And these certainly influenced the questions we asked of our participants. So I am in a decent work research centre, and there are core principles and pillars to decent work around access, rights, social protection and social dialogue. So we did ask our participants about what they thought about some of these things and decent work. I was also very mindful of Bluestein's psychology of working theory and the components he argues are important for work, about need for survival and power, social connection and contribution and self-determination. And we asked our participants things that related to those issues. I was also aware of very long traditional sort of approach to young workers, which categorizes them in three ways: as more traditional workers who are on clearer paths, those that are more liminal, so in between, really, and maybe in insecure situations, but that may be temporary or chosen, and those that are more marginalized in the labour market, and the differences between these groups of workers. In actual fact, my study, when the young people that we did talk to, many of them were in that more liminal category, I would say, rather than marginalized, even though we did talk to some that felt more marginalized. And then just to sort of say as well that I discovered a body of work which was quite useful, really, in terms of this sort of lives in limbo, which I think many of us will have felt during the pandemic, where people sort of waiting, and the notion of the continuous present, and actually people feeling it was harder to plan for the future. And even useful, there was a phrase or a word that I discovered called waithood, which I think actually captured some of the experience of some of our participants. So I just wanted to share some of those sort of theoretical ideas that informed my thinking, some of which were before the project, but also that I thought of as I went along. So I mean, just to say, sort of Tony's covered this and Stephen covered this to a certain extent. We know that COVID amplified existing concerns about young people and precarious work. I'm not going to go through and justify that in terms of my research. The project was based in Greater Manchester. I mean, there's sort of just wanted to sort of say that there's a very strong regional political leadership in Greater Manchester. And Andy Burnham has been very committed to what he calls the Greater Manchester Apprenticeship and Career Service, and to promote a young person's guarantee in Greater Manchester. However, there's still a lot of volatility, even in a region where there's a high level of political commitment to some of these things, really. So at the moment, for example, I know there's a £10 million project that's out there that various people are bidding for around career support for NEET young people. But at the same time, like in many regions and places, there's been numerous organisations that have lost funding, that were providing career support, that have now lost funding. So there's a lot of volatility in our region around support for young people, even though there's a strong political appetite to actually take hold of this and control some of these issues. And a lot of the things that are coming out of the mayoral office are very positive in terms of supporting young people. So what are we doing? Just to sort of set the scene, it's located in one regional location, Greater Manchester. We were interested in talking to young people who were in insecure work, and we particularly prioritised those who'd been working in sectors such as accommodation and food, retail and the arts, because we knew they were particularly precarious, especially during the pandemic. We actually spoke to only a small number of young people, but this was the nature of the project. 21 young people between 18 and 30, and we interviewed them twice. Once in March 2021, and the second wave is underway. So we actually have spoken to 13 of our original 21 now, and we're sort of the project's still ongoing. And we also had an advisory group of various people who guided us along the way. And we actually spoke to numerous local community organisations, and we also maintained contact with some other young people, especially delivery workers who'd participated in a previous pilot project. So we had quite a lot of intelligence in approaching this topic. And it was a longitudinal qualitative project. The idea is you interview people twice, you find out how things change. That was our interest. And we had a biographical interview methods approach to it. And I sort of departed from classic career theory in this study as well, really, because I was very interested in more anthropological approaches and cultural approaches to how people thought about work, even though I'm going to be much more empirical today in terms of what I'm talking about. Okay. So yes, so early empirical findings, and I think this is what is most interesting for people. And I should say as well that many of our young people who we spoke to, I'd call them in that missing middle of young people. So they weren't necessarily very marginalised in the labour market. Some of them, a few of them are students, a few of them are graduates, some of them haven't been to university, some of them had tried university and not completed university. So I felt in some ways they were the missing middle that sometimes gets overlooked in sort of discussions about NEETs or maybe more very successful kind of graduates. They're much more, I think that's a technical phrase of the missing middle in terms of thinking about young people. So first of all, the consequences that we observed, and largely I am reporting on the first wave of interviews here. However, there are some additional things that I'll be able to drop in about the second wave. But certainly these are some of the consequences that we captured in the first wave, really. There was very much that sense of disruption. Many of our young people, they'd had specific opportunities cancelled or postponed. For example, an international volunteering placement, musicians who'd had their livelihood stopped because their gigs were cancelled. There was another young person who'd had a placement at the BBC that was cancelled. Another one who was her job was actually organising events, and basically they stopped, really. So lots of disruption in terms of their jobs. Delayed transitions. Numerous had to pivot and had been obliged to return to the family home because work had stopped for them. A sense as well of kind of lives being on hold, and that reduced confidence in planning for the future. But then many of them were still actually continuing to network. I mean, our first interview was March 2021, when it was one of the periods of lockdown and jobs were more scarce, really. But they were continuing to apply for what they felt was scarce jobs, really. Mental health and well-being really emerged, and I've got some quotes to illustrate this. But mental health and well-being really emerged as an issue. Isolation and sort of increased levels of anxiety experienced. In actual fact, 4 of the people that we interviewed, when we asked them to register their interest, declared a specific mental health condition that they had. So it was clearly something that they experienced. It was quite interesting as well, because even across our wider cohort, there was a much more candour about talking about mental health and well-being than possibly maybe kind of older generations may be willing to share. Another consequence is where we observed that the uncertain lives that they were experiencing, and I mean, COVID has just amplified this. It did seem to reduce their ability to be active citizens. So many of them, when we talked to them about what they might have done in the past, had done a bit of volunteering and had been active in different ways, but had felt now that they couldn't really do that because they had potential work that may or may not happen. And so they had that temporal uncertainty, which meant it was harder for them to commit to other activities in their life, really, because actually they weren't sure what hours they'd be getting with work and things like that. And also for many of them, there was an economic instability in varied ways. I mean, some of them were unemployed and so on universal credit. Others were students who had basically lost their part-time work income. So, were adversely affected, even though some of particularly our students, actually, the few students that were in the study, in actual fact, said that sometimes, they were fortunate if they were on furlough, and some of them who'd been working prior to the pandemic and they were on furlough, they were actually in quite a good position economically, really. So there were some differences, really, in the consequences. And here's a quote, actually, which relates to mental health, which is a quote from Sherelle, a pseudonym. who worked as a care assistant, but at the first interview was unemployed, and she described her the pressure that she'd been on, how it adversely affected her mental health. She'd have to step off the job that she had working in care because she was finding it too stressful, especially as she was worried about how sort of the virus, she might be risking spreading the virus to her own family members. So she talked about actually kind of wanting to access and seek out mental health support, even though she's quite vociferous in a criticism of the Tory government and the underfunding of the NHS, but being very candid about mental health. At her second interview, actually, Sherelle, she's still claiming universal credit, had actually moved into working in hospitality in quite, continuing to work in quite an insecure way, in a way that she wasn't particularly happy with. But she hadn't really properly, even though she had this mental health issues that she described, she hadn't really properly accessed the NHS mental health services properly, and she was still on waiting lists, and it didn't seem to really happened in the way that she would like, really. So it was somebody describing mental health but not having really accessed that yet. And I mean, I would share that probably one of the most worrying mental health stories that we discovered during our study was actually more in not in our main 21 students in our main longitudinal cohort, but in actual fact in the pilot study I worked with delivery workers who some of whom kept in touch with me. And actually one of them during the pandemic had been diagnosed with what he described as mild schizophrenia, but he was continuing to work as a full-time delivery rider. He'd had a number of accidents, getting knocked off his bike, or issues with bike riding. So that was quite worrying, really, that somebody with mental health issues was experiencing such a quite vulnerable and volatile kind of work environment, really. But he was somebody who felt actually stuck in that work. He didn't really feel he could get out of kind of riding for Deliveroo. So anyway, so there's some consequences there. So moving on, we're interested in why people accepted sort of more insecure work, actually. And here's some sort of examples here, really. I mean, certainly during this time, many of our participants felt that they had limited choices, so they would sort of take any job available, really, because they needed to have a job. There was some kind of interesting examples of maybe people who did, there was a couple of young people who did end up working in social care, even though it wasn't really what they wanted to do, because that was the work that was available. For some, they were quite fearful of unemployment and the risk of being unemployed and not having any income, or just having to rely on universal credit. So really compromising what sort of work they would take, and taking kind of worse work, really. We had a number of creative people in our cohort, musicians and artists, and it was quite interesting, really, because obviously the nature of some of these sorts of work is that they tend to be much more casualised, really. And actually it was quite interesting how some of them talked about creative work being not proper work, which was interesting. Interestingly as well, another thing that we observed is that students were kind of quite used to doing casualised work, but it was quite interesting how they rationalised sort of, maybe poor quality work, insecure work as being kind of temporary, and they certainly saw that actually in the future they would aim to have sort of better quality work, and saw a great distinction between the work they were doing now to earn some money and so on, and the work they hoped that more dignified work that they hoped to do in the future. There was also evidence that employers opting for work conditions that gave them flexibility weren't good for workers. Examples of pseudo self-employment, where obviously the sort of some of the platform work can be described as pseudo self-employment, but maybe where freelancers were actually working for one employer, but they were considered to be freelance even though it was a long-term relationship. And there's also this really interesting phrase called family culture, which came out from some of our young people who worked in a hospitality sector, where sometimes kind of work conditions were quite poor, but employers would frame it as a family culture. Oh, we all muck in together, and because we're part of a family and things like that, and actually being a bit toxic actually in places. So actually I've got an example of this, actually, a lovely quote from a student, B, who had been doing casual hospitality work. And so she talks about the family culture, saying, so it's a bit tricky sometimes because we're all, well, a lot of us are quite close. So the manager will often put it in our hands and say, one of you needs to go home. Can you decide who? And you'll be looking at your mates like saying, well, I need the money. So basically they've been called into work, potentially, you know, because it's their day to work. And then actually the business discovers that actually they don't need as many people. So saying, well, actually, can you decide between you who's going to go home? Which, you know, it's not good really in terms of the relationships between the workers, but also, you know, sort of financially for them. Okay, and then sort of making sense of insecure work as well. I mean, there was various themes that emerged here. For some, there was that sort of neoliberal social imaginary, that sense of that things are tough, but, you know, I will, I've got my own ability to make my own way, irrespective of context or challenges. Strong awareness of what decent work should be when we talk to them about that, and you know, the hope for future careers and wanting work that was decent and dignified and meaningful. And that was definitely something that they wanted, really. There was also really interesting kind of reappraisal of values associated with work, both long-term and short-term. So, for example, long-term, many of them, it made them question having a career that might be quite insecure, and actually beginning to think about, actually, I'd like work in the future that has more security and is more meaningful later on. Also in the short term, actually, many of them who worked in hospitality and retail had actually become really aware of the importance of work they did as key workers, and were sort of, you know, it made them really think about some of those roles some of them were doing themselves, but also how we take for granted some of those key workers in society. Another theme in terms of making sense, many of them were very politically critical and aware of the sort of current context and of politicians of all colours and shades. But actually, when we had asked them about specific initiatives that have been, for example, promoted even in our region, not very aware of things such as the opportunity guarantee or any of the things that might be going on for young people, and often had a sense that actually not enough was being done for young people. And, you know, they were aware that things like Kickstart was there, but actually knew that it was quite limited in terms of who could do it, in terms of criteria, and they were aware of that and critical of that. Interestingly, and again, this is sort of the decent work feature as well, when we asked them about, you know, things like trade unions, they're quite positive about trade unions as an idea. But actually, I don't think any of them were a member of a trade union, but they did seem to think that it would be a good idea to have sort of collective action, and were positive about that. Some of them, though, had a bit of a faith in their employer to do the right thing, and saying, well, actually, we shouldn't really need trade unions because we should, you know, the employers, my employer is quite trustworthy, and I don't really need to be in a trade union, and all that sort of stuff. So sort of some possible kind of naivety there, possibly. And actually, here's an example. This is a more neoliberal quotation, really, and this is Adam, who's a student actually who'd been working for Deliveroo, and he was quite positive about how he'd managed to weather the storm of the pandemic, had got quite a lot of different jobs, and had a bit of a cushion of his student loan and family, and had managed to sort of get by, really. And actually he sort of used the phrase, I really struggle to understand these perspectives from people that say there's nothing out there. So this was at a point, you know, when actually jobs were still a bit scarce, you know, before, obviously, Stephen and Tony have talked about how things are increasing, but he was had that sense that actually there are jobs. If you just, you know, get out there and apply, you know, you will be able to get an opportunity. Interestingly, Adam, when we did actually interview him 6 months later, he'd actually had enough of working for Deliveroo, because he realised that the income was a bit too precarious and insecure, and actually he'd gone back into working in hospitality. But he was also planning to do an unpaid internship, so he was still in a bit of a spiral of possibly jobs that were a bit insecure, and not necessarily the best conditions, really. But he had a kind of very sort of that positive, you know, I've got control and things will be all right attitude. So and then scope for resistance. So we were very interested to find out how they were sort of navigating the context that they were in, and make it and sort of managing things. And there were definite themes where young people were certainly rejecting passivity, really, and actually almost sometimes creating new opportunities during the pandemic. So some of the creatives, we had an artist and a photographer, and they were quite fortunate to be able to make work at home, weren't necessarily getting paid for that work, but they were able to make work in their homes in some way. There was a student who actually started a politics blog because, you know, her hospitality job had finished, or was, you know, she was on furlough, so she had nothing else to do, so she started a blog. Others doing work that they'd found unexpectedly rewarding, for example, in social care. So in a way, they did find new opportunities. Many of them, there was sort of an improvisation as well of kind of, you know, finding a job against the odds. And some of the students actually that are in the group actually said they were studying more due to the reduction of part-time work. In actual fact, we discovered really that some of our students, and maybe career advisors in higher education won't be surprised at that, but many of our students who'd been working in hospitality, they'd actually been working far too long hours prior to the pandemic, you know, effectively working 40, 50 hours a week in a hospitality job while they're studying. So sometimes actually that having stopped allowed them to actually study a bit more, really, so, which was interesting. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, I've kind of put the phrase there, optimism against the odds, that some young people, I think it is an aspect of being young that even when things are a bit tough, many of them would think, yeah, no, it'll be okay, I'll be all right, and so on. Lots of evidence of buffering and examples of family and friend support, some positive sort of stories about specific employers who were very supportive to young people, that was really positive. Evidence as well that some of them were quite good at managing systems such as universal credit. They reported that actually universal credit advisors were a little bit slacker during the pandemic in terms of some of the conditionality aspects, and so that they were managing that kind of reasonably well, even though already some of our young people who were on universal credit, there was one who'd actually been told to pay back benefits, and she was quite confused and worried about that because she was being told to pay back benefits. And then linked to an earlier point, lots of very strong political opinions from many of our young people, but generally not very active, not necessarily putting it into practice, and an ambivalence to political action, and quite disparaging of mainstream politics, so feeling a bit sort of disengaged with politics on all sides, really. But at the same time, there's examples of where they were willing to walk away and challenge poor conditions and employment practices, which was interesting. And they were very aware of maybe poor practices that employers might be enacting, really. And I think as well, the pandemic made them much more willing to think about safety nets and backup plans, and to sort of reflect upon those as positives, really. And actually, I've got a nice...
Fiona, I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to step in at this point.
Okay, good. Have I gone on?
Because I think that's quite a good place to kind of conclude. And I do want to leave time for fans for questions and answers.
Good. Okay, so I've missed my, I had some questions and things, but I've nearly finished anyway, David. So yeah, okay. All right. Sorry about that, David.
That's okay. I'm a very strict taskmaster when it comes to balance vegan.
Okay.
You should know this about me from our interactions on Anchor's board.
Okay.
Thank you, Fiona.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks.
So I'm now going to again hand over to Kim Chaplin from the Aging Better Federation to talk about the kind of other end of the spectrum in terms of older workers and the impact of COVID on them.
Can everybody see my slides?
Yeah, yes. That's good.
Brilliant. Hooray. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Chaplin. I work for the Centre for Aging Better, and I'm Associate Director that focuses on the work agenda. Now, for those people that don't know, the Centre for Aging Better is a What Works organisation. We're funded with a lottery endowment, and our vision is about good later working lives, and we work in a number of areas, different interventions, but work in particular in the area of employment is one of those interventions that we think is essential to guaranteeing a better later life. So we tend to focus on people aged between 50 and 70 and look at what they're doing, because actually interventions at that point and changes in that point can have a significant impact on later life, both financially and in terms of health and well-being as well. So we're very interested in increased participation, and up until the COVID piece, we were actually focused on quite a hard-edged target, which was to see 1 million more workers in that age category in the labour market by 2022. And we were on track to achieve that sort of target as well. Where we were was that just prior to COVID, we had more workers over 50 than ever before. Many of them were women, and in particular, they were moving to the labour market because of two fairly, well, one very blunt instrument and one is sort of an emerging policy from the 20th century. So obviously we were seeing more women in the labour market because of the pension age being equalised and extended. But also actually we were seeing more women in the labour market because of things like maternity leave. So we see more women with full-time careers and just progressing those careers into full and part-time jobs later into their life. Overall, though, we had prior to the, I don't know what to call it really, well, prior to COVID, there's an ageing population, quite honestly, like a tight labour market, and we were just seeing this sort of indication of more older workers right across the age range carrying on working for longer. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because of demographics, actually. 1 in 3 workers in this age group. We're seeing elder workers, well, we're not seeing elder workers being replaced by younger workers, and over time the proportion of older workers becomes more and more significant. So we need to think about work in a different way, and in part that's also driven by the fact that we are living longer lives. We've been living longer, our life expectancy has been increasing for decades actually, but actually working lives have stayed largely the same, and in many cases our aspiration is to retire in our 50s and 60s. Well, that's sort of imprinted on us. I don't know if it's an aspiration when you get there. And we know that that isn't a realistic expectation. We have a pension system that was set up for a mid-20th century working pattern when people lived into their 70s. And so a retirement to a relatively short time of 5 years, and predominantly that was designed as well around men's working lives. So what we're seeing is some policy changes that are changing the hard edge piece around how pension, state pension anyway, is paid, and introducing things like automated pension, automatic rollout of pension. But we're not seeing a response in the labour market around the softer agenda, really, which is quite interesting. And it is quite disappointing as well, because actually age diversity brings about huge opportunities to the labour market. There's a very good study, if people haven't seen it, that was published by OECD on the 16th of December last year. And that looks into evidence underpinning the performance of multi-generational workforces. And what it says is that actually a good, balanced, multi-generation workforce puts 1% on your bottom company, 1% on the bottom line of a company. And then I'm going to really oversimplify the statements it says as well. I mean, when it looks at what the behaviours are in that company and where you see those benefits, the really interesting area of benefit is the influence older workers have on the productivity of younger workers. And so you don't necessarily see an increase in productivity in the older workers, and you see increased accuracy perhaps, but actually what you do see is considerably more productivity around younger workers that work in that mixed team. And that sort of asks the question about how we measure performance as well, because we tend to measure performance on an individual basis, when measuring it on a collective basis is a much better thing. The other thing to think about when the business case for employers and organisations is that actually as our population ages, the bit of the population, the banding of the population that has the money and the spending power also changes. And so what we see is increasingly, we talk about them all the time, don't we, the baby boomers, people like me, not necessarily this next bit, but people who have a bigger, stronger spending power, and you want your organisation and your company to reflect your customer base. So there's a push from that direction as well. And interestingly, we're just doing a piece of work with L&G around their services area and their customer service area delivered through telephony and contact centres. And they're very, very keen now to have people on contact centres that have gone through similar life experiences to the people that they are talking to. Which sounds a bit ageist, but it is quite interesting that a lot of their customers, particularly through COVID, have had to deal with some quite hard-edged things around pensions and death. And it's actually much easier to talk to somebody who has empathy and personal experience around that than to talk to somebody that has no experience at all. And so there's an interesting shift in that space happening in terms of customer-facing roles. There's another interesting study, which is very opportune, that's published today by IFS, which is looking at where we are now, which is really interesting because everybody says, well, what's happened with the furlough scheme? We don't actually know. The furlough scheme may have ended today, but we still need some time to understand what the fallout from furlough is going to be. What the IFS study does is it looks at the last 18 months and looks at redundancies. And that is really interesting, especially when you start to look underneath the numbers at how long it has taken those people that were made redundant in that period to get back into work. And what that study, what the conclusions of that report are that actually different age groups and different geographies fare differently. There isn't a generic impact in all this area. And it's quite interesting that they highlight London is quite interesting. Low skilled over 50s in London. At one point, the return to work dipped as low as 35% when, you know, we've seen it at 66% prior to COVID, and 56% of people that were made redundant in the last 18 months found work within 6 months. So we have been seeing quite a lot of movement in the labour market, which is, you know, I think Tony hit the nail on the head in his opening statement. We were very, very, very pessimistic, but actually, the volatility in the labour, the buoyancy in the labour market has been much better than anyone expected. And in particular, young people seem to have done very well. Although they struggled initially, and there is a legend that young people struggled throughout COVID, in actual fact, they're doing a lot better now. And Kickstart is one of the reasons that they're doing a lot better. I think when we started with COVID, our view was that those people that were impacted across the age range, the impact curve, if you like, was U-shaped. So those people at the bottom end of the age range, the young people, particularly full-time education leavers, were hit probably the worst of all. But actually also the people at the higher end of the age range, the older individuals, were hit quite hard as well. And what we don't know, what we know is that they've tended to be more likely to be made redundant towards the end of the curve. And what we don't know yet is whether those older workers have been put on furlough as some form of shielding. We suspect that's the case, and that we're going to see a lot of those individuals flowing into unemployment as the programme closes. But we suspect that is the case. And so looking at that study and looking at where we are now, we feel that actually now would be a good time to focus on those older workers. It's not to say that we shouldn't still continue to focus on the younger end of the labour market. We would never, ever actually put youth and age into competition. In fact, our argument would be for that multi-generational workforce, and that what you need to do is build back balance. But what we also need to think about now is actually how we find the solution that we seem to have found for younger people for those older workers. Over the summer, we decided that we needed to look again at what employers' attitude to age is. And what we find is that it's stereotypical. We find from a D&I point of view that employers, their focus is on race. Quite frankly, Black Lives Matter has lifted that agenda, if ever it needed lifted, even higher. So although they view age as important, and although they view experience as important, they tend to view older workers as inflexible and stuck in their ways and expensive, which isn't always true. So there's something we need to do with employers in terms of selling the benefits and the whole piece. The other thing that's really interesting is when you look at older job seekers in the labour market, and we've got a project called Good Recruitment for Older Workers, which is actually a project looking at age across, we've looked at age across the whole bandwidth. We've looked at how recruitment works for youth and older workers, simply so we can contrast. And actually all workers, whatever their age, experience ageism. That's really interesting for a start. And probably younger workers definitely speak more about it and feel it slightly more than older workers. They definitely report it more than older workers. But what is really apparent is that as you get older, transitions are more risky, and we don't know whether they actually are more risky, but what you see is people not moving around the labour market as much as when they were younger. And when you talk to them about why they're not moving around, it's because they don't see the labour market as receptive for them as they did when they were younger. I think that's fair to summarise. So that's I think quite a challenge for us all, because what we need to see is older workers more comfortable in the labour market and more confident in the labour market, and thinking about the labour market over the longer term, because given the life expectancy and given where we are in such a tight labour market with this pressure to fill vacancies, our 50-year-old has probably got a 20-year working life ahead of them. And yet not very many people in the system that we are working think about them in that way. And whereas we'll see an employer that is investing in people for the future, we haven't spoken to a single employer who talks about investing in a 50-year-old for the future. But that could most certainly be an option, and should be an option in our current economy. 9% of 70-year-olds are still in, 70s and overs are still in work in our labour market at the moment. And yet we tend to be conditioned to think that most people exit the labour market in their early 60s and they've all gone by the time they get to the end of the 60s. And that isn't the case at all. It is interesting that the quality of conversation that goes on with workers in midlife when it comes to training is not very good. And that when we talk to workers about things like what we call the midlife MOT, about reviews and training, a significant proportion of workers feel that training is not offered to them at the same level. Retraining and training just more generally in the company is not offered to them at the same rate or with the same enthusiasm that it's offered to younger workers. So the opportunity to upskill and stay current starts to wane as people get into the middle career. What we have done in the last 6 months, last 8 months, is look specifically at some sectors and some redundancies in the West Midlands. So we know that there's a big job transition change in the West Midlands out of automotive and manufacturing. And so we understand from the local partnerships and the strategic partnership that there's a really big push to reskill people in their 50s and beyond to move into new markets, including green jobs. So we've had been given really open access actually to a lot of employees that have been under threat of redundancy. And we've done some quantitative and qualitative analysis, which I haven't brought the stats to here, but we'd be quite happy to share if anybody wants to get in touch with me on some of that data. But the qual is really interesting because unanimously, older job seekers across all of the range of skills, so from degree qualification to basic skill level, are very, very cynical about public employment services and careers advice. And by and large, they don't even actually, when it comes to working for an organisation that brings in support, say from Penner, in terms of redundancy, they don't really dip into that resource. So they tend to be over-optimistic about their redundancy package and rely on their networks. Predominantly, that's how they find work, is through their networks, not through systems. And through their networks, they tend to find similar jobs. They're not reskilling and progressing. And what happened through COVID was that, of course, networks didn't work in the same way. So we found that lots of the people that were involved in our qual had jobs lined up and then either tested positive, so had to isolate, so had to turn down job offers, or the job was withdrawn because the employer decided to go into a further lockdown phase. So there was quite a lot of people that would have transitioned into something similar. The optimism actually was amazing about them finding something else, but then their transition failed during COVID, and now they are sat in a system. What they did then was they didn't, well, when I say they're sat in a system, they're sat in it depends where they are in the system. What they tended to do then was fall back on their savings and their financial position, they still didn't resort to advice and guidance. And they certainly didn't go to Job Centre Plus. They've got a really negative view of Job Centre Plus. Until they had no money at all, absolutely no money, until they were desperate. And so they saw the whole support system as last resort and felt that their own reliance would get them out of trouble. What was really interesting there was that when they went into the services, their experiences were by and large really positive. And they were really positive about the retraining that was offered to them. They were really reflective about what they got from that retraining and what they got. A lot of it was about reconnection as well, of course, because they were still in quite serious lockdown. But they really felt that that experience opened them up to thinking about learning differently. However, their choice, the vast majority of them, their choices for learning and taking courses was about very, very tight attachment to a job. So we haven't really got under yet whether it is age bias and the fact that time is running out, but they didn't have a lot of appetite to learn about a wide range of things. So there was one guy who had been made redundant from a print company, and his job had been print production, but the end bit of the print production and the packing and the dispatch. And whoever the advisor had been that had talked to him had thought, you know, printing just generically, and they sent him on a desktop publishing course. And he learned how to, I think, create postcards or something else. And his feedback was, yeah, it was really good, man. Nothing else to do really, because it was COVID. And so I enjoyed it, but it wasn't about a job. And what I really wanted was to be told about a job and then to be given a package of training. They very much want route-way driven training, which has been really interesting to us. So there's lots to discuss in there. I'm not going to talk any more about that really. The issue we have is that we are going to have a significant number of a cohort of individuals that are more likely to be stuck in the labour market in the 50 plus group. Although we have got a lot of services, and again, Tony put up a slide showing all those support services, there are nothing in those services that are tailored to the 50 plus group. And we have a question mark about that, because when we talk to the 50 plus group, they do find that an advisor that is more experienced and more like them is quite important. And so they'd like to have a more direct relationship with an advisor, and for that advisor to be of a similar age to them if possible. And they complain a lot about the generic support that they get and being repetitive and being based more around the advice you would give to a young person. For example, when you come to CVs, they have the reverse problem of a young person, that they actually have stacks of information that needs distilling down, whereas when you're working with a young person, often what you're looking for is to get that footprint on a CV and put it all together. So an older person needs to sort out what's most relevant and prioritise from everything they've got rather than that whole piece, but they're often sent on a CV course with young people, and they're doing that sort of thing that's building a CV from scratch, which is not what they want to do. So that's just one simple example. So we've got people that actually want training that's more bespoke to their group. They like mentoring circles with people that are similar to them in terms of age group. So there's something about provision that needs to be more tailored towards that older age group. And then the other piece is the labour market itself and bias in the recruitment processes. So there's something that we need to do with employers that's around actually them thinking differently about this group when they advertise jobs and recruit, because the systems or their organisation is slightly biased away from that older group. And the older group themselves need to think differently about the labour market, because they may well need to do some retraining, and quite often they themselves are a little bit entrenched in the labour market is not for us. It's for, you know, it's pushing against us. They're always telling me I've got too much experience, or I'm too old, or I'm too expensive. So this is an interesting group, I think, in terms of advice and getting them back into the labour market. The worry is that I'm sort of talking here off the top of my head, because there isn't a lot of data yet around this group and why programmes in the past have failed them, but they have. So if you're a 50+ person and you become unemployed, you are 4 times more likely to become long-term unemployed than a younger person. And given the tightness in the labour market and that push and that ratio of vacancies to unemployed people, we can't afford for that to happen. But it seems that when you look at the model, unless we intervene in a different way, that is what is going to happen. And so we are quite concerned that we could lose a lot of people to the labour market, and a lot of people could be locked out of the labour market in that 50+ group unless we address the systems in a different way to what we've done in the past. And I'll finish there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kim. Some really, really interesting perspectives, some thought-provoking information and research that's been shared there. Really appreciate all of the speakers. Thank you very much for sharing what you have. I do feel somewhat guilty about cutting off Fiona. I'm really sorry, Fiona. So I know that you had some very interesting questions to come up later on. So I have posted those questions in the chat, which are reflective questions for all of us, I guess, really, about how to juggle realism and optimism in career interventions, about how to manage and provide support services in a volatile environment and how we maintain the morale of practitioners, how to marshal evidence that interventions work and argue this with confidence, how to navigate the tension between individual, organizational and social economic issues, and how to apply social justice approaches. But one question that I'm going to come to, which maybe kind of reflect back on and start the question and answer session. So there are a couple of questions that have come through already, and I've made a note of those and we'll be asking them, but I'm going to start off by asking all the panelists to give me just one thing that you think politicians, employers or careers professionals, you can pick whichever you like, one thing you think they should be doing differently to address some of the issues that we've talked about in this session so far. And again, you can pick whichever you like, but one thing that either politicians, employers or careers professionals should be doing differently in order to address some of the concerns that we've dealt with. And whoever would like to kick off, feel free to seize the floor.
Yeah, I'm really happy to go first. I think mine would be for employers, and it would be, and this is it's a really, on the one hand it's a really hard one, and also it's really isn't, but I'd really like us to find better ways to talk to employers and employers themselves to find better ways so they can understand their local labour markets, the potential pool of talent and people that could work in their jobs, and just make the really sort of simple changes I think that they often need to but don't make around things like shift security, shift flexibility, job design, and support at work as well that can help people to stay in work. And I sort of reference in particular some work that we did. We're not the only ones who've done it, but work we did for Aging Better, which was looking at this around in particular recruitment practices in relation to older workers. We found loads of evidence of recruitment bias, and a lot of it was just inadvertent and unconscious. It was firms just not thinking about older people as a potential source of work and source of labour, I suppose. So I'd really like firms I'd really like us to find better ways, and a lot of this comes down to like how firms are managed and how we can better engage with them. And it's not necessarily for us to be doing that ourselves or careers professionals, but I do think we need to be much better at having those putting those services in place and being able to better link that sort of support up locally so we can help firms be better recruiters.
Okay, brilliant. So given that you targeted employers, I will now maybe hand to Stephen if you want to throw in your two penneth in terms of what one thing you think one of those groups could do differently.
Well, the funny thing was I was going to say employers, and I'm normally an apologist for employers. But in a sense, I understand the challenges, and it goes back to what I just ended up on, that just the volumes of people that get rejected, and how to find somewhere. And this is a call for almost everybody, really, because it is an operational challenge to give people meaningful feedback when they apply. It just is. It's cost-wise, time-wise, and I think just to say, when people say, "Oh, employers just should do it," misses how it's not an easy thing to do at all. But that doesn't mean that should be let off the hook. So, and it's interesting. I was, I don't think I mentioned this when I was talking, but I was in a conversation a few months ago with the the head of PepsiCo's people for EMEA. And I think he's moved on now, actually. But he was saying that he thinks candidates' behaviour is changing, because of this, getting the testing up front, which in some ways is good because it means that employers will look at more people because they're relying less on older kind of, ways of getting the funnel down, which we've all talked about in the past, whether it's which university you went to, what your grades are, etc. So there's the unintended consequence of these things. But what he said to me was he thinks that candidates are applying first, i.e. going through the sort of the testing process, and then what they're doing, if they get through, they're then choosing, right, well, maybe I'll look into this job. I've got through the first group. No, do I actually want it or not? And if they don't, then they play. And again, I don't think that's particularly healthy behaviour if that's true. I've not seen any research that accommodates it. But I think there is something whereby somewhere between universities and employers, I guess it's an ask for two, is how do we find a way that we can meaningfully get round this. It is a difference in perspective, which is, I can get that the university absolutely has the interest of all its students at its heart. The employer really has its interest in the people it wants to hire, and that's where actually, there's a divergence there. And stuck in the middle of that is the students who get all these reject notes, particularly as more and more students from disadvantaged backgrounds apply for these jobs, who, from the research I've seen, are less likely to go, oh yeah, you know what, I didn't get through that one, but I'll try again, I'll go there. There's some evidence and more to go like, right, that big organization didn't let me in because I don't fit in, so I'm not going to apply to any more.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got employers engaging more with their local job markets. We've got employers engaging more with the people who they don't hire. Kim and Fiona, would you like to chip in at any of this point?
Yeah, David, I can give things for all of these groups to do. But yeah, I'd say for politicians, I mean, we've supposed to be having an employment bill for a long time. It hasn't happened, to address issues around work quality and, things to do with pseudo self-employment, and really, the government needs to get onto it. But I think regional government probably can have some influence on some of these systemic issues, really. But I think politicians, there is stuff to do. I'd say for professionals, because nobody's talked about professionals really, David. But I think we as professionals or educators or anybody, I mean, obviously we're talking about young people here, but certainly from our research, there was lots of examples of the transformative potential of interactions that young people had had with, it could be careers advisors, it could be lecturers, it could be with placement officers, it could be with somebody that they found supportive and sympathetic in the job centre. And some of those interactions could be quite transformative. And so I think as professionals, we've always got to remember that even though we may be dealing with multiple people, loads of people all the time, that every individual that we speak to, we've got the scope to be potentially transformative for them, really. So that's a kind of a, that would be one observation for professionals. So I could give some other ideas, but I'll hand over to Kim.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm quite interested in what everybody could do around that skill shortage piece. And I think what I'd like to see is some strategic joined up responses to the skill shortages. So I'm minded to think about programs that we used to have that ran alongside the old New Deal program called Ambition. And they were sector-led, big employer-led programs that designed routeways for specific groups to get into those jobs. And some, I mean, they tended to be around young people, to be honest, but I think having a commitment from a sector to move a shift of the labour market, of people into their sector, by doing something deliberate and directive would actually engage a lot of people in some productive activity as well as thought. I think the challenge now is the apprenticeship levy, and the fact that actually you've got to do something that makes a business case to the employer to do something different to what they do now. And one of the challenges for the employer is to get the labour. I mean, a lot of them are just trying to get the young people or whoever into their organisation. They ain't going to do it just with young people. So routeways into some of these skill shortage areas would be good, I think.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. One of the questions that came through, and one of the themes that I guess came out of a lot of the panelists, was the idea of the kind of mental health and well-being in the workplace and how that has been impacted, and whether you're aware of any interesting research or interesting programs or activities that are supporting or understanding the impact of mental health and well-being. And again, anybody who'd like to chip in on that.
Sorry, on the impact of COVID-19.
Yeah, and general changing in working practices and things like that. So yeah.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of evidence about how around sort of mental health and work. I mean, there's a few things in there. One is that, we've seen a rising incidence of mental health at work and mental health related absence from work. And I think some of this is actually about disclosure. I think people feel better able to disclose not being okay, not feeling okay at work, and that's good. Some of it I think is about wider sort of social changes and social pressures, and some of it is around issues related to work intensification, work stress, lack of control at work. You look at, there's really good work by the HSE looking at the drivers of stress at work, and it is around things related to control and autonomy, around obviously around workload, around I mean, they talk about sort of six separate factors. It's around, in fact, I've got it right in front of me, how we manage change, how we support good relationships, how we better manage demands at work. I say I've got it in front of me because right now, it's one of the things we're looking at is our own, just as it happens today, our own sort of stress management approach, our stress management action plan as an employer that deals with quite a lot of work, caseload, quite big workloads, and not always the most control over our projects as we might like. So look, I mean, I do think COVID-19 has clearly increased instance of it has increased mental stresses on people and affected people's mental health negatively. I think for us as employers and also about how we talk to employers, I mean, I really do think unfortunately the HSE isn't really funded to do this preventative, proactive work anymore. It's really only funded to deal with accidents at work, sadly. But they've got some really good resources, and I think the more we can do to try to support employers to just think more proactively and positively about how to manage mental health at work, the better. Final point is Steve Bevan here does tons of really good work on this, loads of really good work on this, and he always makes a point, which is kind of presenteeism rather than absenteeism is a far bigger has a far bigger impact on individuals, on firms, and on society and the economy. So we also have to encourage people to be able to take to stop working when they're ill. I hope COVID-19 has actually given us a wake up on that. When people physically had to stop working when they were poorly, I think actually we realised just how big an impact that can have, clearly, when people take the sickness leave that they should be taking.
Thank you. There's another question that's just come in, which I think is...
No, sorry, David, can I just chip in?
Yeah,
on
sure.
I think one good thing is actually, this sounds a cliche, we're talking about it, but I am hearing more and more employers talking about it, or at least it's on the radar. The question is how much is actually being done. And I think there's some really good little case studies emerging where we can show this is what good practice really looks like. And I think in my space, actually, I know of at least 2 or 3 employers who have really understood the preventative approach, so talk about it before it's a problem, so it doesn't become a problem. And these employers, they're actually doing mental health sort of awareness, almost like training courses before actually their intake start. So that's even before they do their induction. They're kind of talking through about the pressures of the job, what it might look like, and how to deal with it. So I think where those pockets of good practice are, the more we can amplify those and encourage others to follow suit.
Can I just say about the other end, because actually our experience, when we went to look at the redundancies, it was really interesting, because although the employers were very open about inviting us in and letting us talk to their staff, and I won't name and shame the companies, the practice was shocking, absolutely shocking. And we've been working with ACAS on some of this, and the feedback I get from ACAS is that there is an absolute bundle of stuff that's going to come out around the way people have exited the labour market and been exited. So I think where it's good, it's good. I think some things just haven't changed at all. There's a big Sheffield company that's just been fined actually for how it's managed its staff through COVID. Because they've demanded people to come in, to the extent that they actually brought a team of people in that tested COVID positive because they were all positive, so they could complete an order. You know, I think there's some shocking stuff will come out of this process. So I think we want to believe that what it has done, and I think it has in part, is made people think about flexibility and remote working better. And it has probably broken the myth of presenteeism and enabled a lot of organisations to do that piece. But I think for each positive, we'll probably find a negative, unfortunately.
Yeah, David, I'll just jump in with a few things. I think it's the Society of Occupational Health and Wellbeing Professionals. They've done some quite good work. I think Stephen Bevan might have even done some work for them around mental health issues, which is, you know, some good sources. But I suppose the other sort of thing to say is that I think it's interesting that there's the poor mental health of people who are unemployed or can't find work, and then there's the poor mental health of people who are probably got far too much work. And we found that actually even in our second wave, you know, some of our young people, you know, their hospitality job had resumed and they were being asked to work 60-hour weeks. But even, I mean, that's obviously in hospitality, but even in more professional jobs, there's tremendous kind of work intensification and people have got far too much work. And actually, where sometimes organisations are, you know, sort of saying, well, you know, here's a wellbeing app, you'll be okay. You know, if you just use this app, that'll sort you out, when maybe there's kind of structural issues about how work is organised and how some people have just got, you know, far too much work. But then that maybe is partly to do with, in certain areas, the recruitment crisis. So, you know, some staff are just having to work really long hours because there aren't enough staff and everything like that. So it's a sort of complex, you know, there's various sort of issues. And certainly I know that I think there's quite been some evidence that, you know, apps, for example, you know, don't work. You know, just an employer using an app isn't going to kind of solve the problems if people's structural things at work aren't right, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody. There was another question that came in. I'm not sure. I want to kind of leave enough time for the discussions. So the question was around the complexity of recruitment practices and the level of competition change the nature of the psychological contract between employers and candidates. But I'm not going to pose that to the panel, but maybe leave that as something you might take into your discussion groups with you. Again, thank you very much for those of you who have already posted to the Padlet. If you haven't already opened it, now will be a good time to do that. And I'll post the link again, because again, if you have got some of these resources and you can pinpoint them and you want to post them up there so that people can access them, that's great. I posted one or two things that people have mentioned, like the OECD report and things like that. But if you have got other things, there are some brilliant things already being put up there, really interesting. What I am now going to do is put you into breakout rooms. I have made it completely random, so you don't know who you're going to be talking to, but hopefully you can discuss some of the things that these thought-provoking presentations have raised for you. I'm going to, as I say, I will split you into, so I'm probably going to be giving you about 10 minutes for each discussion. So it'll be 10 minutes. I will then bring you all out, shuffle you around and put you back into different groups for another 10 minutes so that you get a chance to talk to different people and get different perspectives. So I'm about to launch those breakout rooms now. Hi, Jane. Are you there? Hello, welcome back, everyone. Those of you who still remain, and some of you people have had to slip off. That's pretty much it. I hope you had some very interesting discussions in your groups. It's usually the case at NICEC meetings. It's because there's a lot of very interesting people here. For the last sort of few minutes, just wanted to give opportunity. Anybody, if they want to share anything very, very quickly from their groups, if they think there's one thing that everybody definitely needs to hear about or think about, please do feel free to kind of wave at me or raise your hand in Zoom style, and then unmute yourself and just share very quickly. So over to you, anybody? Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, hi, David. Long time no see. I think the thing that we kept saying in both groups is put careers advice and guidance specialists at the centre of it. Because if you did and you changed the system so that support was there and there was the investment and recognition in the profession, poor old EY, for instance, wouldn't have multiple 60, 70,000 applications, because they'd actually have applications from committed applicants rather than I'll just see. And similarly, then the damage on the individual and their potential, picking up Stephen's point right at the start, would be much who can do better work, who actually then can contribute to society and economy better, and actually live happier lives that need less support from the NHS.
Right, thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to argue with putting career professionals at the centre of things a bit more. Anybody else got anything they'd like to share? I'm not seeing any wave. Oh, got a hand there, Jazz. Is that a clap or is that a hand raised?
It was a clap, but I'll turn it into a hand raise if you like. I just want to say clap for Carolyn, but David, as you know, I'm in the Middle East, and we had wonderful conversations around what we could learn from other cultures and contexts to ensure that, what is currently being looked as best practices in the West, we're now starting to see a shift to look into the East, right? And mindfulness, some of those practices are starting to come in both into the classroom, but also into the counseling room. And so we're quite keen over here to see what might be emerging here from the ground up, indigenous frameworks that we might be able to share on the other side, and that might work there. So this awareness of, we know cross-cultural awareness, it's happening, taking place in the UK, but what might we see emerging from the East, India, Singapore? There's a lot happening in some of our sister organizations, such as NCDA, Ashram. I posted some of those links on the Padlet. Yeah. But looking forward to seeing that happen.
Yeah, and thank you very much for posting those links, and really interesting resources there on the Padlet. So thanks. On that note, just in relation to that, a couple of things to flag up. One is the Career Guidance Guarantee, the launch event, which I think is on the 20th of October, which I will attempt to put a link to on the Padlet, which is all about trying to lobby government to sort of ensure that careers guidance is at the heart of any of the skills policies and things like that. The other thing is to flag is the the April 2020 NICEC journal will be around COVID and career issues. There was a post link in the chat, but please do look out for that, and please do consider putting some article proposals for that. So I would just like to round up by once again thanking our panelists for some really interesting, thought-provoking and insightful contributions. Certainly made me think a lot about different things, and it's kind of informed me, and I'm sure that's the case for a lot of us as well. So I'd like you to join me in thanking them for their contributions. Thank you very much indeed. And please do look out for future NICEC events and other things. We're in the process of planning those now. But once again, thank you for your contributions and for your networking. All the best.